Men of Iron, Chapter 17. The summer passed away, and the bleak fall came. Miles had long since accepted his position as one set apart from others of his kind, and had resigned himself to the evident fact that he was never to serve in the household in waiting upon the Earl. I cannot say that it never troubled him, but in time there came a compensation of which I shall presently speak. And then he had so much the more time to himself. The other lads were sometimes occupied by their household duties when sports were afoot, in which they would have liked to take in part. Miles was always free to enter any manner of the kind, after his daily exercise had been performed at the Pells, the Butts, or the tilting court. But even though he was never called to do service in my lord's house, he was not long in gaining a sort of second-hand knowledge of all the family. My lady, a thin, shallow, faded woman, not yet past middle age, but looking 10 years older, the Lady Anne, the daughter of the house, a tall, thin, dark-eyed, dark-haired, handsome young girl of 20 or 21 years of age, hawk-nosed like her father, and silent, proud, and haughty. Miles heard the squires say, and also Lady Alice, the Earl of Mackworth's niece and ward, a great heiress in her own right, a striking, pretty, black-eyed girl of 14 or 15. These composed the Earl's personal family, but beside them was Lord George Beaumont, the Earl's brother, and Miles soon came to know him better than any of the chief people to the castle, excepting Sir James Lee. For since Miles' great battle in the armory, Lord George had taken a laughing sort of liking to the lad, encouraging him at times to talk of his adventures and of his hopes and aspirations. Perhaps the Earl's younger brother, who was himself somewhat a soldier of fortune, having fought in Spain, France, and Germany, felt a certain kinship and spirit with the adventurous youngster, who had his unfriended way to make in the world. However that might have been, Lord George was very kind and friendly to the lad, and the willing service that Miles rendered him reconciled him not a little to the Earl's obvious neglect. Besides these of the more immediate family of the Earl were a number of knights, ladies, and gentlemen, some of them cadets, some of them retainers of the house of Beaumont, for the princely nobles of those days lived in state a little less royal than royalty itself. Most of the knights and gentlemen Miles soon came to know by sight, meeting them in Lord George's apartments in the south wing of the great house, and some of them, following the lead of Lord George, singled him out for friendly notice, giving him a nod or a word in passing. Every season has its pleasure for boys, and the constant change that they bring is one of the greatest delights of boyhood days. All of us, as we grow older, have in our memory pictures of a bygone time that are somehow more than usually vivid, the colors of some not blurring by time as others do, one of which in remembering always filled Miles' heart and afterward with an indefinable pleasure. It was the recollection of standing with others of his fellow squires in the crisp brown autumn grass of the paddock, and shooting with the longbow at wild fowl, which, when the east wind was straining, flew low overhead to pitch to the lake in the forbidden precincts of the deer park beyond the brow of the hill. More than once a brace or two of these wild fowl, shot in their southward flight by the lads and cooked by fat, good-natured Mother Joan, graced the rude mess table of the squires in the long hall. Even the toughest and fishiest drake, when brought down by their arrows, had a savour that somehow the daintiest fare lacked in after years. Then fall passed, winter came, bleak, cold, and dreary. Not winter as we know it nowadays, with warm fires, bright lights to make the long nights sweet and cheerful with comfort, but winter with all its grimness and sternness. In the great cold stone-walled castles of those days, the only fire, and almost the only light, were those from the huge blazing logs that roared and crackled in the large open stone fireplace, around which the people gathered, sheltering their faces as best they could from scorching heat, and cloaking their shoulders from the biting cold. For at the farther end of the room, where giant shadows swayed and bowed and danced, huge and black against the high walls, the white frost glistened in the moonlight in the stone floors, and the breath went up like smoke. In those days there were no books to read, but only rude stories and jests, recited by some strolling murmur or minstrel to the listening circle, gathered around the blaze, who welcomed the coarse, gross jests, and coarser, grosser songs, with roars of boisterous laughter. Yet bleak and dreary as was the winter in those days, and cold as biting as the frost in the cheerless windy halls and corridors of the castle, it was not without its joys to the young lads, for then as now boys could find pleasure even in slushy weather. when the wet snow is fit for nothing but to make snowballs. Thrice that bitter winter the moat was frozen over, and the lads, making themselves skates of marrow bones, which they brought from the hall cook at a groat or pair, went skimming over the smooth surface, red-cheeked and shouting. Then at Yuletide, which was somewhat of a rude semblance to the Merry Christmas season of our day, a great feast was held in the hall, and all the castle folk were fed in the presence of the Earl and the Countess. Oxen and sheep were roasted whole. Huge sweet puddings, made of barley meal, sweetened with honey, and stuffed with plums, were boiled in great cauldrons in the open courtyard. Barrels of ale and malmsey were broached, and all the folk, gentle and simple, were bidden to the feast. Afterwards the minstrels danced, and acted a rude play, and in the evening a miracle show was performed on a raised platform in the North Hall. For a week the castle was fed upon the remains of the good things left from this great feast, until everyone grew to loathe fine victuals, and longed for an honest beef and mustard again. Then at last, in that constant change, the winter was gone, and even the lads who enjoyed its passing were glad when the winds blew warm once more, and the grass showed green in all the sunny places, and the leader of the wild fowl honked, as though who in the fall had flown to the south flew, arrow-like, northward again. When the buds swelled and the leaves burst forth once more, and crocuses and then daffodils gleamed in the green grass like sparks and flames of gold. With the spring came the outdoor sports of the season, among others that of ball, for boys were boys, and played at ball even in those faraway days. A game called truple. In some parts of England it still played, just as it was in Miles Falworth's days, and enjoyed just as Miles and his friend enjoyed it. So now that the sun was warm and the weather pleasant, the game of truple was in full swing every afternoon. The playground was an open space between the wall that surrounded the castle grounds with that of the privy garden, in which the ladies of the Earl's family took the air every day, and upon which their apartments opened. Now, one fine breezy afternoon, when the lads were shouting and playing at this, their favourite game, Miles himself was at the trap, bare-handed and bare-armed. The wind was blowing from behind him, and added perhaps by it, he had already struck 3 or 4 balls nearly the whole length of the court, an unusual distance, and some of the lads had gone back almost to the wall of the privy garden to catch any ball that might chance to fly as far as that. When once more Miles struck, throwing all his strength into the blow, the ball shot up into the air, and it fell. It dropped within the privy garden. The shouts of the young players were instantly stilled, and Guskin, who stood nearest Miles, thrust his hands into his belt, giving a long shrill whistle. "This time ye have struck us all out, Miles," said he. "There be no more play for us until we get another ball." The outfielders came slowly, trooping in until they had gathered in a little circle around Miles. "I could not help it," said Miles in answer to their grumbling. "How knew I the ball would fly so far? But if I have lost the ball, I can get it again. I will climb the wall for it." "Ye shall do naught of the kind, Miles," said Guskin. "Ye are as mad as a March hare to think of such a venture. Would get yourself shot with a bolt betwixt the ribs, like poor Dickon Cook." Of all places about the castle, the privy garden was the most sacred. It was a small plot of ground, only a few rods long and wide, and was kept absolutely private for the use of the Countess and her family. Only a little while before Miles had come to Devlin, one of the cook's men had been found climbing the wall, whereupon the soldier who saw him shot him with a crossbow. The poor fellow dropped from the wall into the garden, and when they found him, he still held the bunch of flowers in his hand, which he had perhaps been gathering for a sweetheart. Had Miles seen him carried on a litter to the infirmary, as Guskin and some of the others had done, he might have actually thought twice before venturing into the lady's private garden, but he only shook his stubborn, stupid head, and said again, "I will climb the wall, and fetch it." Now at the lower extremity of the court, and about 12 or 15 feet distant from the garden wall, there grew a pear tree, some of the branches of which overhung into the garden beyond. So, first making sure that no one was looking, and bidding the others to keep a sharp lookout, Miles shinned up this tree, and choosing one of the thicker limbs, climbed upon it for some little distance. Then, lowering his body, he hung at arm's length, the branch bending with his weight, and slowly he let him down, hand over hand, until at last he hung directly over the top of the wall, and perhaps a foot or so above it. Below him he could see the leafy top of an arbour, covered with a thick growth of clements, and even as he hung there he noticed the broad, smooth walks, the grassy terrace in front of the Countess' apartments in the distance, the quaint flower beds, the yew trees trimmed into odd shapes, and even the deaf old gardener working be-armed in the sunlight, a flower bed in the far corner of the tool house. The top of the wall was pointed like a house roof, and immediately below him was covered by a thick growth of green moss. It flashed through his mind as he hung there that maybe it would offer a very slippery foothold for one dropping down the steep slopes at the top, but it was too late to draw back now. Bracing himself for a moment, he loosed his hold upon the limb above. The branch flew back with a rush, and he dropped, striving to grasp the sloping angle with his feet. Instantly, the treacherous, slippery moss slid away, and he made a vain clutch at the wall. His fingers slid over the cold stones. Then, with a sharp exclamation, down he pitched bodily into the garden beneath. 1,000 thoughts flew through his brain like a cloud of flies, and then leafy greenness seemed to strike up against him. A splintering crash sounded in his ears as the latest top of the arbor broke underneath him, and with one final clutch at the empty air, he fell heavily upon the ground beneath. He heard a shrill scream that seemed to find an instant echo. Even as he fell, he had a vision of faces and bright colors, and when he sat up, dazed and quite bewildered, he found himself face to face with Lady Anne, the daughter of her house, and her cousin, Lady Alice, who, clutching each other tightly, stood staring at him with wide, terrified eyes.